Welcome today. Oh, goodness, that's a horrible way to start. Welcome to today's edition of the Redacted Culture Cast. I've got a friend and a guest on the show today who's got a bit of a bit of a history, but has also been in the instructing world for a while. And his name is Beau Doboszenski. Don't ask me to try to spell it. So, Beau, would you introduce yourself?
Hello, good to see you again, Forrest. Congratulations on the podcast. My name is Beau Doboszenski. I'm the owner, lead instructor, defensive mindset training. I've been teaching professionally for, since at least 2010. And you can find us at defensivemindsettraining.com. You can check us out at DMT Defenders on Instagram, post a lot of stuff there. And then we're also available on Facebook at Defensive Mindset Training.
Cool. How often do you get teased for DMT Defenders as if you're like fighting off people trying to take your hallucinogenics?
That's only happened a few times. It's pretty awesome. We tend to post like little, hallucinogenic emojis just because it's fun.
Yeah. And then Matt Mason's playing in the background?
Right.
Well, with that being,
we're very libertarian at DMT.
We're very libertarian at DMT. All right, cool. Let's just hope it's like more the Robert Nozick style libertarianism, right. Not the like, I do what I want because reason,
no.
Like any ideology, like low brain approach to it is always a little cringe, but we can move on. Oh, there's another Matt Mason reference. So now moving on.
Right.
If you have survived the first 30, 40 seconds of this show, you know that we're actually at a minute and a half. But this Redacted Culture Cast is basically sponsored by you, the viewer, the listener. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening along. Thank you for your support. If you want to continue on, then you can find us at redactedllc.com. It's also Redacted LLC on Instagram and YouTube. But if you're watching it on YouTube, if you want to leave a comment, a like, do all the social things that help the algorithm, because I'm sure I'm not the only person you listen to. I'd appreciate it. Reviews on Spotify are just not there yet, but we're only 7. This might be 8 technically if I get one in. But without further ado, Beau, you've got kind of a longer, you said you've been teaching since 2010. So as an instructor, like, and I've known you for a while, not since then, but you've been teaching for a while. And there's also a time before your teaching where you spent some time in the military. You were at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier.
Yep.
And and then you were somewhere interesting when September 11th happened.
Yeah. I was
then
direct line opposite of the building of where the plane hit.
The plane being the Pentagon plane?
Yeah, in the Pentagon. Yep.
Okay.
So if he'd decide to come in the middle instead of skipping off the ground out front, he'd come in my office.
Okay. Well, that's serendipitous. I guess you can't say that you get credit for being there at that time in that sense, but you do have firsthand experience. So I'm sure the it was an inside job arguments can get a little tedious.
Yeah. After you can say, hey, yeah, I was one of those guys there flipping over seats with kids still strapped into them. So
yeah, that's tough.
That was less than fun.
Well, we
the guys that we rescued one guy, and it was amazing that the guys had survived. We just couldn't quite believe it. But some of the jet fuel, a lot of it didn't ignite. And so you just had these puddles of jet fuel in there. And we found this one guy who was face down in the jet fuel, and we drug him out to the backside, and he wasn't breathing. So they started doing CPR on the guy. And every time they would compress his chest, you'd have jet fuel coming out every time he would do it. And the guy managed to survive. It was just like, holy cow, like, how did that work? But
in fumes or in fluids? Because both.
It was fluid coming out as you were compressing him. It was unbelievable. Yeah, it was just amazing. So
well, I mean, the world mysteries still exist, but that's pretty crazy. So now, would you say that event was like, oh, you needed that event to inspire you to what you did, or is it just added to where you've become now?
I think what it did, if anything, was sort of change the concept of what I thought made people ready for action, right? It was really interesting to see the types of people that stayed to help and the people that left. And at one point, we were getting ready to go look for more potential survivors or whatever. And I had 4 people with me, and one person was an assistant secretary of defense. which is a citizen. We had a 1-star general. I can't remember what his name was. We had a janitor, and that was my 4-man team. And you think to yourself,
a janitor, and a assistant
secretary of defense,
assistant sec def. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know for what department he was, but that was our 4-man team. It was weird. Yeah.
Well, we're filming on the 20th of October, 2022, which is also the day that the Call of Duty campaign is playable. Which this is what it sounds like. You're like, oh yeah, I've just got an assistant sec def and a general. We're gonna go storm a building and save the world, right? Right. It sounds like, I'm not saying it sounds fantastical as in it's unbelievable, but it's like there are times that happen where you're in events where you're not looking at, oh yeah, I've known Private Jones and Corporal Johnson and for like 5 minutes or 5 years. It's like, we have to do this now. You are, and the sorting process is different. So,
right.
Okay.
Can I tell you one really, really great story from that
launch?
It's actually one of my favorite stories. So at the time I had been dating this woman, and when the whole thing had gone down, right, cell service across the city was basically toast. And so, you see, back then, cell phones were fairly rudimentary. It's only 2001. And so cell service was basically down across the city. So, one of the jokes is always made, well, why couldn't Bush contact DC? Well, because everything was down. And so nobody's getting a hold of anybody. So, and we had heard rumors that, other bombs were going off in the city. Like, we just had no idea what was going on. And so we eventually are kind of staged in the center courtyard of the Pentagon because we're not sure what to do. We're just waiting. And now all of a sudden you got a 3 or 4-star general that's in command. And so he's like, set crews up, and they're sort of delineating, command structures. And, so really hasty figuring out, okay, you over here, you're with them, right? And anyway, at one point, we realized we're just going to kind of be here for a little while. We don't know what we're going. One of the janitors knows that there's a phone just inside this one door inside of the, where the courtyard is. And so, he opens up the door, but he doesn't have the security to go in the door. So this alarm goes off, but just inside the door is a phone on the wall. And so we formed this big queue down the side of the wall in the center courtyard, and people are going in and making calls to try to contact somebody. Hey, I'm okay. Hey, whatever. Well, the only local number that I know is my girlfriend. And so I get on the phone and I call her. And again, we had no idea what was going on. So I get a hold of her. And I said, hey, are you okay? And she's like flabbergasted. Like, what do you mean, am I okay? Right? I said, well, I can't get any long distance calling stuff right now. I said, would you do me a favor? This is my phone number for my mother. Give her a buzz. Let her know I'm okay. I'll call her when I can. And she said, sure, no problem. And so my girlfriend calls up my mother to say, yeah, your son's fine. He didn't die. And she says, oh, thank you. And my mom says, there's no better way for your future wife, this girlfriend is now my wife, to be introduced to her future mother-in-law by telling her that her son is alive. So that's the first time that my wife ever spoke to my mom.
Cute. I mean, I was gonna say, like, I haven't heard that story before, but it is very personal. But yeah, so, well, I guess you two are stuck, because if you ever break up, if you two ever get divorced, it's over for you, man.
That'd be bad.
You're not getting a second chance at that. No. It's just,
I know that's a good setup.
So congratulations. But yeah. Even though it's 20 years too late, but geez, man, that is a bit of a story. Now you also brought up, you were hinting at something that I wanted to get into, which was, I think, I can look at myself in the past, and I've seen it in other people, where, especially young men, where they're kind of looking for a single event to define their lives, right? And so you kind of think of it as like you're joining the military, and you're looking for your Black Hawk Down moment, your day where you okay, I can put it in paper. This was the day that I became alive, or this is the day that I made it. Sometimes that can be perceived in graduating a ranger school or a selection process for SEALs or special operations, Sometimes that can be misconstrued as like your first deployment, your first this, your first gunfight, you're okay. You know, you got all these different lists, but I think it's not uncommon for us to, whether it's artificially produced through culture and movies, or it's natural, as in we're like, there's something to being human that needs a rite of passage, but we're looking for some event to sort of define and change our lives. And once that happens, then we can become a real whatever it is.
Oh, right. Absolutely.
So you have this event that takes place, but in retrospect, was that like a life defining moment where was this a baptism of Beau before, Beau after, or how did that play out?
I kind of think that there's about 3 or 4 events that I can think of in my head, and it's tough to determine which is the one that you would say that this is, you know, this was that seminal moment. If there was a seminal moment, that it was that one was to say, if something goes bad, could I simply respond? And the answer now that I have is yes, right? If something goes bad, whatever it is, I know I will just simply respond. And I think that was actually one of the most beneficial parts of it, is to say, okay, you know, since then, right, I've been around, you know, serious car accidents. I've had kids get into serious injuries and had to do stuff. And you start going, right? And you find that other people will stand there and look at you just like, what do I do? And once you've had one of these events, it's not hard anymore to say, okay, you do this. And they go, oh, okay. But you, for some reason, seem to be this person that can take off and just keep going, whatever the problem ends up being. So I think there's that one. If there's another one, I think that I had, and I think this moment has to come in every, I think for sure in every man's life, is the moment when you realize that you're separate from your own father. Like, that was a huge one. It actually occurred just before I got to my first duty station when I was in the military. I had come home. I'd been through infantry school and airborne, and I was at home and getting some stuff, and I was taking it to Fort Myer where I was going to start my duty station. And I remember sitting at the kitchen table with him, and my dad is he's a really impressive guy. I mean, high school education. He's got a multi-million-dollar business. He works his ass off. He's really an impressive human being. And he's also a really big personality, right? And so we're sitting across from the table at each other, and he says, you need to do X, Y, and Z tomorrow. And it's like, I had already had plans in my head of, well, I'm doing this, and I'm going here, and then I've got a long drive, so this is what I'm going to do. And he looks at me and says, you're going to do X, Y, or Z tomorrow. And I remember looking at him and saying, no. And he just looked at me. And for the moment, like, we all of a sudden had this realization that I was my own independent man at this point, and all he could do at this point forward was to ask, right? There was no more, you know, as long as you're in my house under my roof, you'll live by my rules. Like, that was over. And we both had this sudden understanding that existed. And I think that was one of the other ones where it's like, I look back at that and I go, okay, so that's the point that I said I'm independent, and right, the responsibilities are now all mine. They're no longer responsibilities. I don't go back to my parents for anything more on the responsibility front. Like, that was it. And between that one, I think in 9/11, and then you know, a couple others, but like those two, the ones that stick out in my head the most, is to say, you know, these things had to go by to be able to say, okay, I'm actually a man now. Like, I'm actually a grown man doing what I'm supposed to do.
So I want to pick at those a little bit, and not in a facetious way or you know, but like, so you have an event that from anyone's perspective but your own is rather banal. It's your dad telling you being an adult, your dad telling you to do something, and you saying, I have passed the stage where you tell me, now you ask me. Like, it's not Hemingway, but it's a little bit of this, like, to the outside world, it doesn't mean much. To the inside world, it might mean a lot. And then the second one, you have this 9/11, where you're at 9/11, which, with the exception of you being who you are to get to that location, it's not like you plan to be there when some event would happen. You're more or less, you are reacting to something. So the one where you have the most agency, I think, agency is the conversation with your father.
Oh, I agree completely.
That requires you to. Interesting.
And like I said, I think the part that's so fascinating about it is, go ahead. But I think the thing is that to me is the biggest striking part about it was the moment there was a realization of, I have my own agency separate from from my father, right? I have, in essence, in this very small sort of banal way, I've really stepped into, right? Everything afterwards is on me. And, there's no doubt that being my father, whatever, I needed help or something, right? He'll help me out. But the whole relationship suddenly had a shift. It had a change. And that was a really valuable experience, I think, for both of us.
Yeah, I always looked up. I have always looked up to my father, as in I was fortunate to have a good relationship with my father. Although I do remember the first time as an adult looking at a decision that my dad made and said, "That's not a good decision."
Right.
And it was unusual for me, because it's like, at one point in my head, there's like, it's not like the rebellious child be like, "Oh, Dad, you don't understand." It was like, you're not acting in a way that I think you should here. It was a scenario. It doesn't matter. But he was like, it was just like, oh, okay. I am looking at my dad's behavior on a certain event, not liking it, and then, I mean, was it all resolved? Yeah, it was. There was no
Sure.
like long-term significance to it. It was just interesting. I remember my mindset going, "Dad, you shouldn't act this way. I'm not in charge of you, but I'm looking at you do something and go, hey, okay." And then, of course, they changed it. We all do our things, but sure. I do remember that moment very clearly. I almost remember that moment. Sometimes I remember that moment more clearly, how I felt, what the color of the ground was, what the lighting was like. More clearly than I do remember my first gunfight a little bit. Like,
right.
Oh, well,
and I think the part that's
so
so interesting, right, is because, we have the schema in our head as to how it is our parents and who and what and how our parents are, right? That they are these people that almost exist. I mean, if you grew up in how can I say this without sounding bad or obnoxious? What I mean is, I think for most of us that grow up in a home where we're not constantly surrounded by a certain level of depravity or whatever, I mean, like, we're not abused or anything like that, right? Where, there's not something that's going on around us where we're watching our parents sink into some sort of complete pit of hell on a regular basis, right? You start to get this sort of schema in your head that, your parent is something that operates in ways that almost seem well beyond you, right? Like I want to use the term, it's almost like you're better than I am, right? And
yeah, I
think the moment that we realize that from a I'll use the term a sin, right? Because I don't know, there's another better way to say it if you have one. But like, when you realize that your parents sin as much as you do, right? That they're not this sort of infallible thing, it does suddenly change the way that you feel, not about how you care about them, but you suddenly have this change in how you feel about the things that they said and the things that they did. You say to yourself, where did that come from? What was that? What part of that thought process that they were doing before did that come from? I always wonder, especially for you, and it'd be an interesting question to ask you, right? So you have a lot more time under combat experience than I do. We're just not even close. Oh, no. I didn't go overseas and deploy or anything like that. But I always wonder what that would have been like to come back and have your dad there, and knowing that your dad didn't experience any of that. Like, that would be a really interesting question I would have for you.
Here's a tragedy. I don't know, here's a tragedy. All the internet fights with what it does. I lost you for like 3 seconds. You said, here's a question for you. And then I wondered what you would think about that. Basically, your entire question was missing.
Oh, darn. I'll try again. So
it's probably in the recording, but I need to hear it.
You've been in, way more episodes of combat and conflict than I ever have. I didn't get deployed. So I would always wondered what it would be like to be a son coming back with those kinds of experiences, and looking at at your father, a guy that you would have said would have been your warrior poet, your hero, right? And knowing that he never had any of that. He never went into these kinds of places of darkness. And I always wondered what that would have been like to come back and sit there and have him look across at you, and you start to tell him even just a little bit of what that experience had been like.
Yeah, there's a couple stories actually that I could use for that one, for between my relationship with me and my father, and one of them was a bit of an emotional one that's been coming up a little bit more in private conversation. But when So I went to Ranger Battalion. I passed Ranger selection in 2009. Did 2 deployments, and then so anyone who's been in Ranger Battalion knows that I wasn't the favorite private. Did 2 deployments, and then ended up changing companies and did a 3rd deployment and went to Ranger School. Got my tab, became a team leader, did a 4th deployment. That's kind of the story. And so in Ranger Battalion culture at that time, and I believe it's still the case now, is that there's a caste system, people with your tab and people without your tab. Everyone's got a scroll, but your tab, and this was at the time where you're deploying once a year. So having, a deployment scroll and a non-deployment scroll or a unit scroll is kind of common, but that tab was a very big social caste system determining factor. And so even though Ranger School itself, there's some, you can go to Ranger School and run in some challenges there where it's like, oh, wow, this isn't as much of a rite of passage as I expected it to be. It was still treated as one within the culture of Ranger Battalion. So my parents come down, and I am approaching, or I am in, or kind of within this time period where it's almost peak nihilism in the military, where it's sort of like, I'm very cynical about the system itself, and it all seems kind of plastic and garbage. And so I'm graduating Ranger School, which had its difficulties, but at that point in time certainly didn't have this massive rite of passage feeling to it, right? And maybe whether or not that, well,
you'd already faced life and death,
I've been on a couple of. I'd been on a number of deployments. I'd been in a number of gunfights. I'd been in a number of situations that were hair raising. I've been and the hardest part, at that point in time was actually the social dynamics of inside the unit. I found that much more difficult at the time. Partly because I grew up. It doesn't matter, and so now I'm graduating Ranger School, and I'm graduating Ranger School, getting my tab pinned on. By a squad leader who's very proud of me because he had to send me there and take the risk and see what's going on. And my parents make the trip to come down all the way down to see that, and they book hotels. And this is not an easy time for my family, right? They're not sitting on the economic high horse, but so like they and my dad is just bubbling with pride that his son has accomplished so much. And they come to the ceremony, and I get my tab on. I'm like, okay, cool, let's go get a burger. I don't want to be here anymore. And they're all, and to this day, I've been able to reconcile it with my dad, but it was dumbfounding because actually, I robbed my father of the ability. I robbed my father of the opportunity to be proud of his son because of my own bitterness. Because of my own bitterness. I had become bitter against the scenarios that I was in. I was bitter against different, Ranger School isn't that hard. I mean, it is, and it isn't. There's hard things that you have to do, but but it's not like it's, I don't know how to, I got to find other comparisons, but I robbed my father of an opportunity to stand in front of other men and say, that is my boy. Look at what he has done.
Yep.
And that hurts.
Yeah.
That I haven't really, and so I think I've been talking for a while, but when it comes to my father and looking at where I'm at in life now, is that I could very well sit here and say, and this is even interesting how it applies to some of like the military, veteran, civilian conflict culture, controversy, whatever you want to call it. It's a bunch of garbage anyway. But is that I can look at my father and say, you unproven man, you don't understand what it's like to be in a gunfight. You don't understand war. Like, I know you're concerned about your safety, and he's got his concealed carry, and he takes care of his family. He does all these kind of things. I could definitely say that, but I think it'd be really hard because I do respect my father. However, it's like, for 30 years, you have woke, or longer than 30 years now, I'm 32, but For longer than 30 years, you have woken up every day, and instead of going, what do I feel like doing? You said, this is the right thing to do. And it's work and figure something out and work and figure something out and work and figure something out, not to become not. And when bad things have happened to him, did he become a nihilist alcoholic? No.
Right.
And when things didn't go his way, did he yell at the world and say it was unfair? Yeah, but he also worked and he figured it out.
Next day he got went to work.
He made time. He got up to go to work, and he made time to spend with his family, and he made time. He made sacrifices in a world where he could. It's not like my father was not raised in a position of like, oh, you went to Harvard and all. He's a Midwestern man. Right, a Midwestern man who has worked hard and raised his family, and there are all these things that you could say about it. But like, so me coming home from my deployment after, getting my first kill or whatever you want to call that garbage, whatever it's like, and then going to my dad. Yeah, it was a struggle to help him understand, but where I failed was that I did not give him the opportunity to be proud of the son that he raised, because I was bitter at the world. So I guess I kind of put that on its head. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's a bit of an emotional story.
That is. That's fascinating. I mean, it's one of those ones. I'm sure it's not. And how can I say this? It's very unique to you. I'm not sure that necessarily it's unique to all of the men and women that have been, in the combat zones for the last 20 years. They probably, a lot of them have had this thought, whether or not they had the ability to reconcile it. So I guess my follow-up question to it, because I think that's a really fascinating tale, is my follow-up question is what is it that it took for you to sort of say to yourself, okay, he went off and he did this thing, and he, as you mentioned, like, he was always working. That was my same thing with my dad, right? Like growing up, I saw my dad in the evenings on Saturdays. I saw him for church on Sundays. And because he was doing 60, 70, 80 hours a week or 100 hours a week, especially in the summer times, because my dad owns an excavation company. So we're in Minnesota, man. You got to work when it's warm. Once it's cold, you can't do it. It was a really, it was sort of we didn't have that same kind of connection as kids. And so you go off later and you do these different kinds of things that were really different from his own experience, right? Him being a guy going and working this job starting at, 15, and you come back and you have to say to yourself, okay, well, I had these struggles. I did these things. I overcome these problems. And there's a part in your head that probably you say to yourself, well, man, that was nothing as compared to. And I think one of the things that would be hard to reconcile for all of us, and I think that it's something that we all need to do as sons, and eventually we have to do it as fathers, is we have to reconcile the fact that, your experiences are your experiences. And then the question ends up being is, how can I go back and like you said, take away the bitterness so I'm not creating more wounds here? How do I go back and be able to say, I want to share this with you so you understand how this goes? And so was there a point in time where you said to yourself, hey, the way I'm processing this about my dad is wrong? And did you ever have a moment where you said, okay, I can connect my dad's struggles to, what made him a man? Can I help him to step in and see what I'm doing or what happened to me, in my journey into manhood? Like, did you ever have something that hit you? Was it a book or a philosophical thought? Like, did something hit you to say, you know what, I need to rethink this?
Let me kind of work through that. So was there a moment, I'm going to try to distill the question. Was there a moment, or is there a concept that once understood helped me or changed my perspective or gave me an understanding to not only repair this element of the relationship with my father, but translate the differences in our experience into something mutually like gainful or further like deepen our relationship?
How can you go and connect and say, your journey through manhood is here's how I can connect these emotions into my journey through manhood?
Yeah, I think that is not going to be an easy question to answer, but one of them is actually when I came to kind of understand the story that I was just telling. Mm-hmm. when I was able to go to my father, I think it wasn't when I realized that I needed to apologize to my father for how I had treated him.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think that's what it was. I think when I realized that I needed, and it wasn't because I felt bad, like, oh, I feel bad, so if I apologize, the feeling will go away.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can certainly do that. You can sort of fake apologize to assuage your sense of guilt. But
Right.
it was, I think it was when I realized, like, it wasn't that I was just selfish, because, you know, if I make the accomplishment and you come to celebrate my accomplishment, it's not selfish for me to want to celebrate the accomplishment, or even
Right.
like I get to celebrate it however I want. Right. That's
Right.
sort of the attitude that was presented. Well, Dad, I'm the one who went to Ranger School, and I'm the one who went to deployment. And I'm very thankful that you've never tried to like fake understand how I feel right now. But I can't explain it. So let's just like, go get a burger and a beer. No, it was like,
right.
You know what I mean? It was like, I think within the context of that story, that's one of them of like,
sure.
I think the story helps explain it a little bit, but the other, that was one part. I know that's answering the same question with something we already talked about earlier.
No, but it builds.
I think
it builds the thought process, right? And so if there's somebody listening to this that realizes they're struggling with some sort of communication system with their own parents, right? As long as everybody's approaching it in good faith again, right? That you can walk up and go, hey, let's chat about this. Here's some of the things that went down. Here's how I felt about those things. Or the thing that I found that really helped me to make sort of adjustments and changes in my life was when I started asking about the history of my own family. And you started to learn more about what happened with your parents or with your grandparents and things of that nature, right? So I have relatives that were in Vietnam, and a lot of them still barely, if ever, discuss any of that. I have relatives that were in World War II, right? One of my grandparents' sister was one of the nurses near Bastogne, right? So I mean, really, really just fascinating stuff. And I think that by us going and trying to ask questions and understand our history, our family history, I think we really can start to step out of our own box, right?
I had to move there's a text chain. Someone's talking, whatever, it's my fault, not yours. And so so everyone knows what's going on. But when you start learning your family's history.
Yeah.
And then did that like instill a sense of respect for them? Did you have a challenge with comparing your accomplishments to that of your family? Like, oh, you have a business, but I'm a veteran kind of thing? Or was it
No, I think it was more, I think you tend to see, we have a bias as human beings to try to remember either things that are wildly tragic or generally good, right? Mm-hmm. So an example I like to use
and that you're being specific there. Wildly tragic or not wildly good, but wildly tragic or generally
wildly tragic
good.
And generally good. And it's a really unusual element to us as humans, right? We kind of hum along like, it's okay, right?
It's also Midwestern, by the way. You got to understand that's like Midwestern. That is like Midwestern, Swedish, Polish, 100%. Like it's very like, I remember reading a book on my mother's father's table, like coffee table book was like how to speak Minnesotan, and it was never say things are good. Yeah, right. Like chapter 1, you never say things are good; they're just not bad.
You always express things in the negative. That's how it works in Minnesotan, right? So how are you doing? Not bad, right?
Not bad,
right? So that's how you say it.
No. Yeah, I'm a transplant. Don't ask me to do the accent.
Yeah, no. Learn the new accent. Fit in. No, I think one of the ones that it does, right? So because I think we as humans, right, we generally kind of hum along, that when you go back and you start to ask about these questions about, the family history, eventually some of the wildly tragic things start to come up. And as those things start to come up, it gives a different perspective for even the tragic things that existed in your own life. Right. So 9/11 was a terrible tragedy. but my grandfather got to watch his younger brother run over by a tractor. That's going to be like a terribly tragic thing, right? And that, you suddenly start to grab that and you say, that's, to watch your own kids. So I have 2 kids to crash myself. Like if I get injured, it's like, okay, to watch them get injured is darn near the worst thing, right? It's way worse than that. And if you see somebody else, a random person injured in a terrible way, right? You and I are both in the defense industry, right? We can go and watch videos of violence like a quarterback watching the defense of another team. It's like, oh, that guy shot, stabbed, his bones are broken, whatever. But my son went over the handlebars in his bike about 3 months ago, broke a collarbone, broke his wrist. And that was much more impactful as far as, an emotional hit, like an adrenaline hit, than hundreds of videos that I've watched of people in much more excruciating violence. And so you start saying those questions to your parents and letting them start to tell you these stories, your grandfather telling you about X, Y, and Z, or, hey, you learned this from your grandmother about what happened, with her family growing up and the abuse that she suffered. And suddenly it's like, whoa, wait a minute. Like, I didn't know any of that. And some of the feeling that you have that your experience of tragedy is so unique, it kind of goes away. And I think that it's through stuff like that where we can start to, as people that may have been through something really traumatic, start to reconnect the people that we don't think would understand it. Because everybody does have some kind of a level of tragedy in their life. They've experienced it. You just got to ask them what it is.
Yeah, I remember struggling with the concept of PTSD because in some ways there's a dark side to the diagnosis. I think that there's a dark side to the diagnosis of PTSD where in some ways, if you claim it correctly, it can become very profitable. And it can become very social. It can become fiscally profitable in certain arenas, and it can become socially profitable, right? I mean, you can make cultural criticisms of victimhood narratives. You can make all of these stories, but even within military people, there is a certain, it's not a double standard nor a gray line. It's a duality. 2 things are true and in conflict with one another. That is the idea of PTSD, because you can, as much as people have traumatic experiences, which leave effects on the person, there's also the ability to sort of justify bad behaviors by identifying with a specific negative event or or general negative event. Right. So, I'm not an alcoholic because I make bad life decisions. I'm an alcoholic because my team leader was mean to me, or I mean, that's a little crass, but like there are ways where there's a dark side to it, which unfortunately must deal with the immensely and inherently personal aspect where 2 people can walk into the same event and walk out very differently.
Absolutely.
We're at an ambush and one guy is, we're ambushed and one guy walks away with no emotional trauma that he's either recognizing or other people can see. And the other guy is hallucinating being up with only 1 round in the chamber, on his last bullet, running through the trenches, trying to find the Dishka to not die. And they're very different experiences. And it's not exactly the so-called strength of will of the characters that is the sole determining factor.
Oh, yeah, very much not. I agree with that.
But there is a dark side to PTSD and the way that it's diagnosed and the way that we treat it as a culture that is definitely looking for past negative experiences, or worse, inventing them to justify current bad behavior.
Right, or current bad emotional states. Yeah.
Yep. I can't manage my anger because I saw my private die. It's like, hey, I can understand it, but I can't justify it, dude. I can understand it, but I can't. It's not justified. You got to figure it out, man. We got to work. But I'm here for you.
Right. Let's work through this. Let's
if
figure
I
it
can
out.
be.
Yeah, and I think that's where there isn't. So I was just recently in Chicago. I went to a week-long training at the Force Sciences Institute. And we were studying things like human neuroscience and neuroperformance, primarily engaged in, law enforcement related shootings. And I'm trying to figure it out from the sense that, there's a lot of science dollars dedicated to law enforcement officer involved shootings, but not a lot of those science dollars are being translated over into the citizen side of the house. And so I happen to know the guy that's the head of it, which, by the way, that's somebody you should have on your podcast. That would be just fascinating. His name is Bill Lewinsky. I'll get his contact info.
I would love to have that. Thank you.
Yeah, Bill
Lewinsky?
Is spectacular. Yeah, Lewinski. Bill Lewinsky. Dr. Bill Lewinsky. He's, lots more skis, right? Skis, we got to hang together. So the big element that they, at one point we were talking about things like...
I was just in Poland at a concentration camp. The timing couldn't have been worse. I was visiting. I wasn't there in one, okay?
So wonderfully dark. That's awesome.
We know it. We understand it. Like it's sort of an inside joke, which is unfortunate for some people, but like it is like, that joke could have been taken terribly.
I know.
So, I can laugh. Yeah, but okay. So Dr. Bill Lewinsky you're having a conversation.
You mentioned concentration camps. I have to plus up my family. We were actually at the Holocaust Memorial last November because I was out for Tomb 100, and we went when we were going through to show the kids. We took the kids through it. We got to the righteous among the nations, and we're looking around. I walked over to the D's for whatever reason, and there are two Doboszenskis among the righteous among the nations. And I went, no, come on. And so I had to reach out to my uncle, who's sort of the genealogy guy of the family. And I said the names, and he's like, oh, yeah, that's your whatever. And I was just like, cool. So you ever have these moments where you wonder, yeah, my family did that. That's so cool. Anyway,
I have met plenty of people with like, okay, you can. My father's father was a prisoner of war for 3 years in Korea, so I got to hear his stories. So yeah, some of it was the wild. Like I'm cooler. There was no way for me to do the I guess there kind of was, but like, and I don't think, and my dad would never do this. But if I ever had the idea of like, Dad, you don't understand, I was deployed, he could have been like, cool, we're shipping you to Iowa to talk to your grandfather. And he's like, yeah, I was a POW. Like, I was, my grandfather's got purple, he's passed now, but he's like Purple Hearts. He was in World War II in Korea. He was a POW for 3 years. He hand carved a chess set that we still have, so it's like part of it is the like, okay, you think you're a cool army guy, here's your grandfather, and you're like, oh,
right.
So, I got to respect my grandfather a lot more after I spent time in the military. But
absolutely. So Bill Lewinsky, they're studying. Go ahead.
I'm just making memory, like
the memory thing.
Yeah, so, like I'm making the memory wipe. Go.
The Bill Lewinsky was talking about this part of the training, the certification process. They were talking about how it is that we have certain kinds of uptakes of memories. And what they find is really, really interesting is that you can roughly establish identical scenarios, force on force level scenarios, stuff like that. And people never remember the same things. And it's this really fascinating element. So the idea like that you go through this terrible tragedy, there is not necessarily any guarantee that you walk into any kind of mental issues, whether it's PTSD or whatever. So the science right now is like, just because you went through something traumatic has no bearing as to whether or not you're going to have PTSD at all. And so they're still not exactly sure how the heck that goes down, I thought that was really fascinating.
Have they tried to apply that same concept to other forms of knowledge? I can think of like a political joke version of it where like, what is it? Don Lemon was trying to tell a meteorologist that the hurricane happened because of climate change. And he's like, but I experienced it, so it's true. And the meteorologist is like, that's not how it works.
That's not how this works.
I mean, it's a funny exchange. It's a funny exchange because you have a guy who's not a professional. Fine, not a professional in the environment. Like in the environment, God, this is just so many layers of double entendres. You have a guy who's a newscaster who is interviewing a man whose job is to supposedly understand the weather. And even though we have skepticism, we have room for skepticism of experts, and we have room to doubt people who have accomplished it. You have a guy who's saying, well, you're wrong because it's really about climate change because I lived there once for like 3 weeks or 3 months or whatever. And so, so I'm talking about knowledge, like how experience translates into knowledge. And you see within gun culture as a whole that in some ways experience is valued very highly, and in some ways it's not at all. Right. So or like you can experience something honestly, like,
or sometimes it gets overvalued. Right. So suddenly you have somebody with all this experience, and that's cool. Right. Like I'm not discounting your experience, but tell me again how that violates the laws of physics. I'll wait. And, I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of what I would call a Dunning-Kruger effect, right? That thus I've done this, thus I know everything about it. It's like, I don't think that that's true. And so, no, I think where you get guys like Don Lemon going is, well, I've been told what I need to know, therefore it's all I need to know, so therefore I'm right. And, I think people sometimes they go through these different experiences, say, well, that's all I need to know because I did it, right? That's it. And it's like, well, no, right? I mean, there could actually be a lot more things we could work on. Yeah, I think it's actually one of the biggest issues. You go ahead.
No, I was just saying, politics aside, I think there must be at least a delay enough where we're starting to talk over each other. Which, if it doesn't sound bad, I was able to fix it in post. But the point being said is that politics aside of the Don Lemon event where he's talking to the meteorologist about the weather, what you're seeing there is you're seeing a guy who doesn't want to understand. He just wants to get his point across versus a guy who's like, right. And so like, and it's not that he doesn't want to participate. He's not trying to participate in the conversation. He's trying to present a thing. And
he's not I can think of scenarios where he's telling a story.
Yeah, and he's not only that, but like he's approaching a person who he's supposed to be an interlocutor with as if he was a lecturer, right? Because I can think of it this way. If I'm teaching a class in CQB or urban reconnaissance, which apparently is the trending thing now, or if I'm teaching a class, there's a certain level of resistance and interaction that's acceptable, but that line can be passed, right? And you could think of this in the teaching scenario of like the what if issue, where you're trying to teach CQB to a person who hasn't done CQB before, and they're asking you like, well, what happens if they're hiding in the rafters? Like, okay, shut up. We're going back to clearing your corners and opening doors. You know what I mean? Like, thank you for your contribution, which is absolutely meaningless to the productivity of this environment. Like, well, and sometimes there's like you can listen with scenario, but I don't know. It's not as simple as like everyone's voice is valid. It's like
I think the biggest challenge that we have, especially in the teaching environment right now, the big challenge we have in the teaching environment right now is that everybody wants to debate you on tactic, but they don't want to practice technique. And so the trouble ends up being is your ability to apply a skill set in any given situation that's right. So I always say a draw is a technique, right? Draws should happen at automatic levels, should be an unconscious application. There should be no RAM involved in that at all. And when do I draw the firearm becomes a tactic. And it's like, well, guy, your technique is not very good right now. So why are we discussing the tactic? Let's focus here. And once we've achieved that level of automaticity, well, now we can start creating all of these different ways in which the stimulus that could exist to cause you to draw the firearm can now start to be broached. But it's like you've got your neural pathway, you've got your cognition side versus your stimulus side of that neurology. And you're trying to get me to get you to the stimulus side when you can't do the cognition side yet. It's like, let's slow down. Yeah, build one path before you build the other.
Build the meaningful path. Yeah, okay. I mean, not meaningful in a Jordan Peterson sense, but in like, yeah, okay. So make sure you can do the action before you start talking about when you should do the action. Right.
Yeah. So if you're still having this person struggling to clear corners properly, or enter the door without like flagging the guy in front of them, or, you know, they're entering the door with the rifle stuck way out so they get it taken away from them. I mean, all the bad stuff that you don't want them to do, right? Or their mount speeds are slow, or their splits suck. It's like, okay, we're not going to start discussing if somebody's in the rafters, right? I mean, just, you have to go back and get this part right first.
I think there's a room for a criticism, or maybe not a criticism, but like a challenge to that issue, though.
Sure, go ahead.
When I'm teaching something, when you're teaching something, sometimes you have to use the why. I'm not saying that, you know, right? So you run into a bit of a problem that could be circular, in the sense of, okay, don't get too caught up in the what if scenarios until you learn the fundamentals or the skills, right? But in order to teach the skills with any sort of not a correlation to reality, the person learning the skill is either better off or necessary to have some sort of context by way they're learning the skill. And the perfect example is entering a doorway, right? So I can teach somebody. You could be in a sense instructing somebody that when they enter a doorway, they don't want their muzzle to be hanging out in the doorway, lest somebody be able to grab it, even though that's not super common. It doesn't matter whether it's common; it's super catastrophic. Right. I think I was listening. You know, right? It's super catastrophic. I was listening to somebody, I can't remember who it was lately, who was talking about room clearing and clearing corners with your eyes, but not necessarily with your gun. And it was an interesting one, because I think when I heard his presentation, I as soon as I started steel manning his argument and trying to understand it versus going, he said don't clear your corner with your gun. It's like, okay, that makes sense. I know what he's trying to say. Although unfortunately, he came across too strong, saying, well, you can have your rifle at the low ready and enter a room. It's like, no. But you know, like when you're teaching somebody, I'm sorry, I derailed that one. When you're going back to,
no, I don't mind at all,
clearing a room or entering a doorway, you know, I can say, okay, when you're entering a doorway and the door's closed and the door's open, you do not want your muzzle to hang out in the doorway, because that's going to tell everybody, it's going to telegraph when you're moving. But now, and they're like, well, what happens if they're blind? Or what if there's like, no, wait. Yeah, I can get the question. It should be the instructor's discretion to be like, that question needs to be postponed. And if the student isn't willing to listen to the instructor's discretion, then he should probably find a new instructor, check himself, right? If the student, if you don't trust the instructor, don't take classes from him.
Yeah, why would you be there?
And every good instructor that I've ever met, worked with, or trained under was fully willing to engage with his audience without wasting time with stupid questions. And that was a skill set that they developed. Like, that question will be answered later. Focus on we need to focus on this. And if the student listens, like, because I think there's I think there would be an interesting amount of material to address the student-teacher relationship within the firearms industry, considering the gun culture, within gun culture, considering all the nuances of what teachers do teach, don't teach, could teach, won't teach, pay for teaching, the relationship of ego between the student and the instructor becoming too pompous, the student not caring about the instructor. Like, all of these are interesting issues. And since all of gun culture in America is inherently voluntary, it's sort of like you can't just crush this question with bureaucracy. So,
well, yeah, I mean, I agree. And especially, you know, from an independent, you know, firearms instructor and stuff like that, you know, part of our, you know, teaching philosophy when we teach at DMT is we always say, I have 3 to 5 reasons why for everything. And the reason means is we do that because I want you to know that I've thought about this. I will also tell people, like, if I don't know the answer to a particular what if, I'll say, I don't know. That's interesting. Let's explore it. And we'll see if we can figure it out. Because we have to always assume, again, especially if we're working with somebody that's further along in the skill set chart, is it possible they know something that we don't? And then from there, you get a chance to explore these techniques. I think the biggest element that we have to keep going back to as much as we're able is to be able to give people reasons why that exist outside of saying what I call an appeal to experiential authority, right? Because I was a SEAL, because I was a Ranger, because I did X, because I did Y. And that's where it's like, your experience is good. Like, I'm glad about your experience, but a lot of times I see people use that as though it's a cudgel that ends the discussion. And it's like,
yeah, well,
instead of let's go,
you see it in like,
instead of
you
seeing
see
it
in politics too.
Yeah,
Gosh.
totally.
I have a Purple Heart, therefore I know. And you're like, oh,
right.
And that's not how it works.
Yeah, it doesn't work, right? And so, one of the things that I think as instructors, we should really try to kind of strive for is, one, that we know how it is that people actually learn how to do these skill sets, right? We have a generalized understanding of human learning, human performance, neurological skill set development. That, two, we can break things down to things that do not require me to rely on my own experience to be able to tell you how it works, right? So I should be able to go back to, hey, this is how physics works. This is how the gun moves. This is how bullets fly. This is, right? And this is how your eyes work in the dark, right? And, this is what happens when you go under lots of stress. And so that way you can now start to go back and start to reconnect that neurological element with the physics. And so now what you're providing for that person is, you have this sort of this really deep buy-in, like, okay, look, this isn't some fly-by-night thing. It's not, oh, well, he managed to do that. Like, I'm never going to get, 4 or 5 deployments or whatever it is. So I just have to trust because he had that many deployments that it's going to be correct. And I think that's just a really dangerous thing for us to get into from an instructor standpoint. Again, not saying that stuff isn't valuable. I just don't think it holds. I think we put too much weight on it.
Yeah, Dufresne and I were in a conversation, John Dufresne from Kinetic Consulting, which would have been like the episode recorded before this one. And I came to the conclusion that the single most important aspect and determining factor of an instructor is integrity. Which can become, with more consideration, can become a little diluted. Like, well, everything comes down to integrity. Are you honest? Are you smart? Are you do you do the work to make you smart? Do you do the? I can understand. Exactly. It could become a little bit a bit of a monomania, a one box checks all kind of problem.
Mm-hmm.
So, as an instructor, the appeal to experience is the same thing in logic as the appeal to authority. It's not whether or not it's true. It's because I said so.
Mm-hmm.
And just because a person has an experience does not mean that they are either teaching well or the fact that they're teaching something correlates to reality. Sometimes you survive harrowing scenarios because of accidents. Sometimes.
Luck,
and sometimes
providence.
it has nothing to do with you.
Yep.
Your teammates are better than you at everything. So those are I mean, no one wants to admit that they were the turd on the team, but sometimes you are. And some days you are and some days you're not. But
that's exactly true.
Well,
yep.
and that's and the integrity of the individual is able to recognize and communicate with a cohesive team saying, hey, today's not my day, but this is I don't know, maybe I'm speaking out too far, but it seems a little. It seems like I go down that road and then I start looking back at it and I'm expecting something completely unrealistic from an individual, which is damn near close to omniscience, which is not a good conclusion.
Right. I think as I've been doing this and I've been teaching for as long as I have, if I struggle listening to a lot of the instruction from a lot of other people, and I struggle with it because the arguments tend not to come back to physics and physiology and neurology. And as I'm sitting there, I'm like waiting for you to go, okay, I need you to close this circle for me, right? And I need you to close it for me with some kind of data. And when I don't see people come in with certain kinds of data, it really bothers me a lot. So one of the ones that at this Force Sciences deal, they got deep into this discussion of human performance, especially the utilization of the eyes as it relates to surviving gunfights. And the overarching gist, and Bill can get into this a whole lot deeper than I can, but the overarching gist is you have two different ways that you can be focused and two different ways you can apply your attention. So your focus could be narrow or it could be broad, and your attention could be internal or your attention could be external. And what they discovered is they were doing these tests with they had these glasses that they would wear, and it's got a camera in the front. And so they can see wherever they're looking, but then it's got two cameras inside that focuses on their eyes. And so on this computer, it's projecting where they're actually looking, where their pupils are focused. And so now you can actually see what are they actually looking at when they would run these scenarios. And they use this for, NASCAR drivers and pilots and pro ball players. And now they're starting to use it on law enforcement, military operational groups, because if you can improve, what am I doing with my eyes?
Are they putting him in those 280 degree units that you see at like Travis Haley's location, or Vortex has got one too? I forget what it's called. You know what I mean? So like you got the guy who's got a sim pistol, probably not. He's not a cert pistol. He's got a sim pistol with a magazine and gas blowback, and that projects a laser that triggers an aiming, and then you've got projectors on basically an octagon -1 panel, and so it shows it. Is it doing that all around, or is it really just a one wall kind of thing? Do you know?
Actually, it's a set of glasses they wear, so they're doing full sim scenarios with them. So it's real actors.
Oh, so like
yeah.
Oh, even better. Crap.
Yeah.
Okay, go. I am excited.
Yeah,
tell me more.
Yeah, it's cool stuff, right? So you can look this up. It's called the Mesa study. They did it in Mesa, Arizona. And they studied a whole bunch of different police officers. They put them through this scenario. And so what you have is this scene. It's a car accident scene. And you've got a truck kind of like this. And there's a minivan like this. There's another car kind of coming like this. And there's about 6 different actors in the scene. And so the police officer gets the signal that this is going down, but he's kind of far away from where this scenario is going to happen. So the first thing he has to do is he gets the call, and then he has to go through a high-speed driving course. So as soon as he pulls up to the place, he's already at 120 beats a minute when he gets to the scene. And so you got heart rate monitors on and all kinds of stuff, so they're monitoring that. And again, because it's a wireless system, as he's looking with his head, you get to see, like first person, where his head is pointing. But then because it has the cameras inside, what you see is a little circle, and there's a line to another circle and a line. And so you watch this tracing, and you can see where his eyes were and are. And so you can see what he's looking at. And so they get out of the car, and there's where the truck was here in the front, the truck was up here, and there's a guy over here. And as soon as they get out, people start crossing in front of the police officer. The guy behind the truck smashes the side of his truck with a baseball bat. So it's an auditory stimulus response. So as soon as that happens, the average heart rate of the police officers went up to about 160 beats a minute. And then the guy with the bat goes to the guy at the minivan. Guy at the minivan throws a plastic cup and hits the guy with the bat in the head with it. So the guy in the bat goes back to his truck, comes back with a gun. So that's the scenario. But what they're watching now is the police officer, and what are they doing with their eyes when they get on the scene? And yeah, so the big thing they found, right? So remember, you can be narrow focused, broad focused, internally focused, externally focused. And what they discovered is that the place that people win these gunfights, they win these scenarios, is when they're externally and narrowly focused. So I am focused on that thing right there. That's my problem. And they learn how to find the problem and then start to make engagement with it. Whereas the officers that are broadly focused don't do very well. And the officers that are narrowly focused and internally focused do not do well at all. In fact, those are the ones that fail completely. And what's really neat is you're watching.
How are they determining that a person is external versus internal? Because I can get the broad as in like they're scanning. I can see they're scanning. I can that like if I'm still scanning when there's an event going on, then I'm obviously not focusing on the event. But internally, I know when I'm internal because I'm going, oh man, I'm not the one for the team. Oh man, do they not like me? Am I going home? You know, like it's when that nagging voice is not in the back of your mind; it's in the forefront. I know when I'm internally focused.
Exactly. Usually, the way they describe it is they get to the point of oh-ish, 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 oh-ish. Right. That's where you tend to be the internal narrow. Well, what they're doing, so you can see on the people that are broadly focused, the officers, their eyes are going like, I mean, it's all over the place. It's like they never figure out what they're supposed to look at. So it's like they're seeing nothing because it's just all over the place. The ones that are narrow external, you see them go face, hands, position, communicate, face, hands, position, communicate. And suddenly when they pick out the problem, it's just like everything else stops existing and they're just staying on the problem. And the next way you can tell if they're internally or externally focused is you can see what their eyes do as they engage in the draw. Because eventually, right, the thing goes to gun. And if you see their eyes dip to the gun, you've got internal. Versus if it stayed on target and gun lifted to you, you were external.
Perfect. That is a perfect. That is really cool. Like, because we've been, spoiler alert. I used to sort of teach you and I were in the same school. You were the guy above me. And so we've had these conversations. What? Well, no, you were in a position of responsibility. You held more responsibility. So, but this is like what? That was almost, you do believe that was almost 10 years ago, right? That was 11,
almost
that was
10
9
years ago. That's a long
time.
Right? I know. Yeah.
So we've known each other for a while, but so now you went to the Institute, you just said earlier this year, right?
Yeah,
and
I was
saying
just about
the guy who's got okay, so they determine that a person is internally focused when his eyes go from threat to weapon to threat.
Yes.
Okay, that makes sense. That does make sense. In
fact, a lot of them won't leave the weapon. It'll actually their focal point will exist on the back of the slide. So you'll see the slide moving and their focal point is still there. Whereas when they are focused on target, you'll see the target, their eye following the target and the slides moving kind of underneath it. It's fascinating.
It also makes sense. And then it's also not a surprise. So here's a derailing question. I'm assuming they showed you multiple videos.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Did those people who were doing this scenario have any sort of choice in the equipment they were using? Like was one using their iron sights and one using a red dot?
Yeah, they were using their own stuff. Some people did have red dots. Some people had irons. Yeah. But it was whatever their normal equipment was. They just swapped out barrels.
Do you recall if the people using iron sights were more likely to be internally focused than the people using red dots being externally focused, or is this?
No, they didn't have any correlation to that actually. And there is some. Okay. There is some. So data, Go ahen't No, you. Okay, so I hate this lag. They didn't have necessarily correlation between the two. So they've run this study multiple times, whether you had a lot of optics available and you had a lot of irons available. And what they still found it was where was the attention focus that made the bigger deal. And the second element that made the bigger deal is who had a better level of automaticity in their neurology. In essence, who's spending more of their intellectual mental RAM running the gun versus those that are like, I run the gun like I'm, moving my hands like it's just normally me. It's an extension of me. There is some data to suggest that optics can sometimes have a deleterious effect on the stop. And what I mean by that is you have this neurological path that you have to run to kick any action off, right? So you have to take in stimulus. It has to go through a perception period. Then you have a selection of options. Then there's a signal that sends to the action, like action go. And now finally your action kicks off. And then once the action kicks off, let's say we're pulling the trigger, right? So there's a rhythm in the hand movement as you're pulling the trigger. If all of a sudden in the middle of that, they shut off, they give you a signal of stop, right? That signal of stop, there's the same lag that has to occur neurologically before you stop. And so since the average, a police officer or even citizen shooting a gun in threat situation speeds is roughly quarter-second splits. You're getting off anywhere from 3 to 5 shots before you get through that lag process and you actually stop. What they were finding from the optic is that as the gun would go off, their attention would go from the target to the optic and their lag period would get longer. And so you have to keep working with the concept of focusing on the bad guy. Don't let yourself become suddenly engaged on the optic itself.
So are we capable of making the conclusion that the time between observation and act in your OODA loop of going from standing to shooting is not affected by the red dot, but going from shooting to not shooting is?
That's what they're seeing right now. Is it can be? It's the stop period that seems to be slower.
So it's not that it. So the danger of a red dot on top of a handgun in this scenario, in this description, is not that you're slower to engage. It's that you can become sucked into tunnel vision.
Yeah, you're sucked into the gun itself. Which tunnel vision isn't necessarily bad.
Yeah.
It ends up being that our perception goes to the optic rather than to the threat.
Well, tunnel vision itself isn't bad. It's the inability to move in and out of it. That's the issue.
Yeah, to get out of it. That's the bigger one. Right, exactly. Yep. Actually, when you think about it, the idea of being externally narrowly focused is a great description of tunnel vision.
Very much so, yeah. No, and it makes sense, too, because it matters. When you need to perform, you need to be able to focus on that object. And I do like your use of the term RAM. It's like, yeah, if I have practiced so little with my handgun that the one time that I have to use it, I'm thinking about, oh man, I should have done more dry fire. Then then it's like, that's what's getting in the way, dude. It's not the gun, it's you, right? You can see it on the competition field. You can see it in performance. You can definitely see it when you're doing room clearing. And room clearing is very humbling to people because when you're like super narrowly focused because you haven't practiced a couple of skill sets like panning and foot placement and all these other kind of things, that you're running into the door frame as you're entering the room. Mm-hmm. You can tell that you're not able to take that focus and go you have no control of your own aperture. You have no control of your own aperture of attention. And so that would make sense. That would make a lot of sense as far as attention.
We started to make a series of videos. We're working on it. And the concept is like, I want people to go and do room clearing. And what we do is we kind of show a video of a guy doing a basic entry. And we say, hey, you want to work on this skill, practice these skills. And so then we go through and try to break down the subset skills of that entry. And so it's like, that's what you should be spending your time when you go and do your practice. Spend your time on these subset skills. So then when they can go and train with somebody like you, right, those subset skills are wired as nicely as we can. So now I have the RAM available to start playing that game of chess in CQB, that working 2 moves ahead, because I don't have any RAM left working on, oh, well, that's how I pie a door, and that's how I make a step in, and this is how I pull the weapon back to retention and replace it, right? All of those underlying skill sets now are the ones that we practiced and we've got built to those levels of automaticity. So then we can go in and we can get this further growth of now, instead of making room clearing this element of I have to apply all of my RAM, I can apply, a little bit less every time because I've done this so much. I've built these skill sets, and especially the foundational pieces that allow me to walk in and really take the most advantage of what, somebody with your level of expertise is offering.
So I'm going to segue gently into, you spent the better part of a decade building a online video curriculum that, as you've been describing, doesn't supplement in-person instructor training with instructor training. It doesn't replace, it supplements. Jeez.
Right.
I had one thing to say and I couldn't say it right. It doesn't replace. I know. You had one job. Say the word replace, not supplement. Supplement. No.
No.
Apparently, narrow internal focusing. Ugh.
There it is.
But so your curriculum, which is available, how? And this isn't the end of the conversation, but like, how is it available?
So it's through something called the Defender University. And
okay,
it's at defenderuniversity.com. And we're about to try and do a big revamp and how it looks because, we're trying to work with somebody that actually helps us to know how to design things because I teach guns. I have no idea how web design works. I stink. But the thing that we did that we tried to make that was different. When you start to go and you look at neurological development of skills, what we find is that the people that make the most progress are the people that are engaging in small block distributed learning over extended periods of time. And so,
okay, so say that for people who don't read 1,000 page neurology books for fun. It's small block instruction periods over time. Is that what you said?
Yep. Small block instructional periods over extended periods of time. So the idea is, how do you do a little bit of work over and over and over to be able to do it over a long period? The example I always like to use, right, is, if you go to a 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, 5 day jiu-jitsu camp, are you ready to go roll in an MMA competition? Right? Like, no.
Nope.
But if you spent 5 or 10 minutes a day doing jiu-jitsu, right, would you be able to roll and defend yourself if you had to? The answer is yes. Right? And so what we're trying to do is establish a means by which somebody can pop onto the site. And the way that it's set up is it has 4 workouts for dry fire per month. And there's 4 or 6 drills per week workout. Watch the video, like 2 or 3 minutes. Here's the drill. Here's how you set it up. Run the drill. Here's how you make it harder. Here's how you make it less hard. Okay, go spend 5 minutes doing it. And in the course of 10 minutes a day, over the course of time, you are really going to develop. And the way that it's set up is it's designed to be able to help you, keep working all these different sort of subcomponent skill sets. So now when I go and work with with you and a CQB, or I go and work with a, maybe somebody's going to do like the carry trainer S12 or whatever they're doing, right? That you go and you walk in the space having built these baselines that allow you to take the most advantage possible out of, that training that you paid so much money for. So that's really what it is. That's the thing that we did that's different. And it's enough material. You could be on there for years, and there's that much material.
Well, you have been working on it for years, and so
it's been a while.
It's yeah, and well, the next question there'll be this. Don't answer this question now. How have you seen it, and how has it changed over time? And how have you seen your content change over time and the culture around it? But I'm not. I'm going to talk a little bit so you can kind of put all that together, because I know it's not a short conversation. But so even as I'm not like actively teaching, I'm not advertising classes right now. But one of the challenges of being a teacher is it becomes extremely repetitive and difficult. And when you look at it going, wow, I can understand why somebody wouldn't want to spend $600 for a 2-day class on basically how to draw your handgun. Now, for a lot of people, that is a skill that just needs to be learned and polished and practiced. And you're going to go through some errors and you're going to make some mistakes, and fine, so be it. Right. But I cannot, even being like Handgun 101 can be a tiresome class to teach over and over and over again, because in some ways you're like, okay, 101 is good, but 102 is like, you can supplement a lot of that on your own work, but you still got to go back to a 102 to do it with a guy who's like, okay, cool, tweak it, and then you can move on. So I can get that from an instructor side, where it's like, you can only, I don't know. It's not that there's a market cap. That's such a that's such a dangerous way of looking at it. I think it's more like there's a certain emotional difficulty to teaching the same like lower like intro level skills, right? We were talking with or whatever, but it's like night vision's a really good example. There's a lot of information on intro to night vision. There's not a lot of info on intermediate night vision. So
right.
So has that been long enough? Can you answer the question I started with of like, you've been doing this for a while. How have you seen go ahead.
Yeah. So let me engage the one thing from before, actually, what you were just saying. I think it's really valuable. From an instructor side of the house, I think the most important thing that I can do, so I have other instructors that teach with me and stuff. And I actually have them tend to teach more of the advanced classes. And the reason that I do that is the idea actually came from a cooking show. I don't watch a lot of TV. I watch almost no movies, but I really like travel and cooking shows. So one of the ones I was watching,
finer things in life.
That's right. I was watching one that was following this chef, and he was in like Norway or Sweden or something. And he's got like this backwards setup for his kitchen. And normally in kitchens, right, your lowest chefs are doing all of the prep work for the cooking, right? And so they're prepping the vegetables and they're prepping the meats, and right? And you do that for a really long time. And then you go and you do this, and then you go and do that. And in this guy's kitchen, he's actually got it reversed. So the newer chefs are doing most of the actual cooking. It's all of the really advanced ones that are doing the prep work. The reason being, and it's a really great argument here, it's like the quality of the cooking is entirely based on the quality of the prep work ahead of time. And so sort of the role that I kind of took on for myself was I knew I was never going to be somebody like, like yourself that's teaching these really high-end deals. I always wanted to set up a situation where, can I be the person where when they come to work with somebody like you say, what have you done before? And they say, oh, well, I'm an advanced student with DMT. And you're like, oh, rock and roll. And you're like, because you know the baseline that's been established is really good. So just like if you were to go to study jujitsu and you could spend all your time working in classes with the black belt, the chief guy, imagine how good your baseline would be. And then you can go train with a guy that's not nearly as good as you got further on, because your conceptual baseline element is so much broader and so much more robust. And so for me, whenever I think about teaching the basic handgun stuff or basic rifle stuff, to me, the thing that goes in my head is I go, this person goes as far as I can establish their baseline. And so to me, it's always like, the reason why it does sometimes get a little repetitive, like I feel, because you're always saying the same things, right? You develop this spiel to where it's basically automatic. But the part now where suddenly I think we can make the most difference is in that first period of time when there's so many errors that you can help them correct as many of those foundational errors as possible. So they're not building themselves, in essence, they're not building themselves eventually a glass ceiling that they can't escape past, right? Because those errors have become so rooted in the sub-programming that it's hard to get out now. And so I think that if instructors can kind of look at our baseline classes that way, like, no, this isn't about, I got to do this to get them to stuff that's fun. No. Their ability to do anything later on is entirely based on what I help them to establish right now. And that sort of helped to reframe this to me, even though I've been teaching an intro to handgun class twice a week for the last 10 freaking years, that's the part where it's like everything they do from this point forward is based on how well we got this done. And so that gives me sort of a sense of purpose in it.
Okay. It's a very well-spoken project. And I think that, the time you've been doing it does serve as a testimony itself, but it is, I don't know how to say this any other way because I'm going to end up saying something silly, but okay, it makes sense. Like there's no part of that that's theoretically it's very clear. What you invest in the small parts does contribute to the whole, and your effort is into the culture as a whole, as opposed to the Beau Doboszenski pizza pie of instructor peoples. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, well, are you Team Lucas or are you Team GBRS?
Yeah, right.
Oh, whatever, dude.
It's like I hate that stuff. I hate it. It just drives me nuts.
We all do, but we also love it. Like, let's be honest. It's like, oh, did you hear what such and such said? And then you're like 5 minutes later, I hate myself.
Maybe I'm the weird guy out of the house, but I handed off the looking of all of those things to one of my other instructors. And I was like, if there's something really that you think is super valuable that you think I should look at, do that. I have this strange personality where, like, if I see something that strikes me as it's wrong, this isn't right, something's off on this, and then if I can't do anything about it, it's like this lingering nagging, I'm annoyed with it, right? Whereas if I can go and say,
you say that's a weird personality, that is not unique. I think that is specific to, I think that is not quite endemic, but that is gun culture, right? Where like,
oh, sure.
You know what bothers us all it's like, oh, the ATF it bothers everybody, right? It's like, right. Oh, great. They're going to make, we're all going to be felons in 5 weeks. Woo! But there's exactly. a dark side to it. And I think that's actually a really good way to start breaching into mindset and mindset and kind of culture writ large, because because it's baked into the cake. You can't get away from it now. Mindset, in one hand, is a very trendy word that people like to use. For example, I remember walking past a magazine rack and seeing something called mindfulness. And then I opened the page and I started reading the article, and it's like pseudo philosophy of like maybe 1920. Like, oh, they're exploring questions that like, bro, that shit was answered a long time. That question is not original. You're just navel gazing at this point in time. Yeah. And they're trying to like replace, just like the word science, replace the word natural philosophy. You almost have this attempt of like, we're discovering new spirituality-isms, and you're like, none of this is new. Like,
none of this is new.
Dude, Gnosticism has been around for a long time. Gnosticism is not a new idea. So like, that's right. Oh, we're deconstructing our faith. Oh, so you're a pagan. Gotcha. Cool. Yeah. There's the fire.
And there's some that sounds like alchemy to me. I think I've seen that one before. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So, but I'm criticizing. I'm presenting this to you as the term mindset can be oftentimes misused, misconstrued, or abused as a marketing term. And then on the other hand, when we talk about mindset, so that's one way where it can go wrong. Another way where it can go wrong is kind of in the alchemical Gnosticism mentality, where mindset is now situational awareness, where you're James Bourne or whatever, and you can like see the floating dust hair and then be able to determine the exact location and motivation and nationality of every person in a 50-foot radius, because I've got a secret mindset. Look, there's a bicycle chain there. That means there's going to be an attack by it's going to be a Swedish poly-American friend, with a French diplomat visa, and his name is Boris. Like, well, none of those things go together, but whatever, right? You know what I'm saying? But like mindset. So how have you seen the language of mindset change, and how have you, what was a lesson in the concept of mindset or an idea that really stood out? Like, what is mindset? Let's start with that. Yeah, let's define it.
Sure. So when I define mindset, I think the way that I would define mindset is establishment of the state that would be around the state that you would use to engage in defensive action. And so I think we have different kinds of mindsets for different sort of actions in our life, right? You have different sort of glasses that you would put on that would establish what it is that's the most important for you to focus or pay attention to, right? So we have work glasses. In essence, you have a work mindset.
Is it like a pre-orientation? Like, I don't know. I struggle to be too broad or too narrow with this one, but the idea of mindset is just like, is it a trained thing? Is it an untrained thing? Is it a conscious thing? Is it an unconscious thing? Is it
I think it honestly
produced
could be
by habit? Is it?
I think it could
diet
be
focused.
I think it's all actually a number of those things, right? So if, for example, if you use the glasses example that I gave, you could choose to put on your work glasses, and the work glasses highlight things that are important for you when you're engaging in your work, right? You have your family glasses and you highlight the things that are important for you. Sometimes though, those glasses are forced on us, right? So if all of a sudden you found yourself in a defensive encounter and you were wearing your family glasses, suddenly the defense ones have to be forced on you. You don't have a choice in the matter. Ideally, of course, what you would do is you would establish what set of glasses that you were going to wear before the situation went down. And that's now where we can get into the concept of certain elements of situational awareness and things of that nature. But I'm a person that doesn't believe that you can be in a particular state of of any mindset for extended periods of time. We're constantly changing what our mindsets are. And so I think that what we can do is, rather than let ourselves being forced into a particular mindset, we could actually have more of a choice in the matter. And so, for example, when we teach situational awareness, the first step in the actual system, not what we first teach, but the first step is something called an environment assessment. It's where am I and who's there? And once you determine what that environment is, now you can establish what's my personal condition level. In essence, how much emphasis am I placing on my security, right? I'm in my house right now. I'm in a rural area in Minnesota. All my doors are locked. My dogs are calm. The alarm system is on, right? The awareness level is super low, right? So in essence, it's conversation mindset. But if I decide I have to go someplace that's more risky, where I don't control the access, there are possibles and actuals in the area, well, suddenly the glasses that go on for security go on. And then that mindset now changes heavily into defense versus, hey, I'm at home on a conversation.
So then that includes both sort of a conscious approach to triggers, and then a methodological approach to reactions. So like, it's not, the reaction itself isn't just go to the pistol, draw the pistol, sights, trigger, squeeze. It's
right.
How do I train a step back of, I can identify the threat. Okay, cool. Boom. That's what it is. Like, it's it's maybe not all that chill, except for whatever. But so that would make sense. Okay.
I think the way that a lot of the gun culture would understand,
I find mindset very difficult. Yeah.
I think the way that a lot of gun culture would understand it is if we talk about it in the concept of the OODA loop, right? So most people that are listening to your program know what that is, right? So OODA is observe, orient, decide, and act. The trouble with OODA, I think, from a conflict perspective, is that when you're in range of real conflict, your ability to orient your brain to what's going on, which is prefrontal cortex rationality, and your ability to engage in decision-making process, which is also prefrontal cortex, it gets suppressed. So I think a different way to think about mindset is what's going to pre-establish the O and the O and the D of the orient and decide portions of the OODA loop. So in essence, you can pull those out and you can replace them situationally. So if you know that you're in a spot where it's chill like I am right now, you can take the O and the D's to be, well, I can spend more time observing what's going on. I've got more time to act. If I know I'm in a dangerous environment, I'm going to replace those with my plan of conflict, whatever that looks like. And so now what it is your brain's almost pre-staged to say stimulus in, response out, because we sort of preconditioned ourselves for it, right? It's the real scientific way. Go ahead.
So in using it as in a metaphor state, as a metaphor, mindset isn't about trying to produce some superhuman perception of the world. It's, you have a way that things work out when this OODA loop, which I think the challenge with the OODA loop is the same thing with like phrase like slow is smooth, smooth is fast, or
right.
sheepdog, wolf, is that like it gets so used and so sometimes abused and so marketed. It's like, oh, he said OODA loop, he's in the know. And it's like,
or tactical.
I think the challenge is that it's not, and to be honest, when a word becomes very useful in a scenario, it will get used a bunch, and eventually it will wear out its welcome, and they'll have to find words to nuance components. So it's not like, oh, he said OODA loop, he dumb. It's like, but you can kind of fake the funk for a while and miss the ship in the fog, and so doesn't mean anything. But as a metaphor, you're saying the mindset, the way that you're tuning mindset is that you're saying when you go from observe to orient, your orient and decide plays are choosing amongst a hand of cards versus drawing the picture mid-flight.
Right. That's a great way to describe it.
So that makes sense.
They're preset systems that we've built over time, right? If you watch a basketball player, right, the basketball players don't randomly come up with plays, right? They've been building those plays as a team for however long. When you engage in CQB, right, your engagement of CQB isn't you randomly going on the fly. It's a series of plays that you've developed over weeks and weeks and weeks, months and months and months of doing CQB together. And so our ability to engage in defense shouldn't really be a whole lot different, that we've established, if you will, a series of plays, and that we can go and just extract the ones that we need given our stimulus that's coming in.
Got it. That makes that, it really does help in the sense of divining between two ways that mindset is used as a term. I think it's detrimental to think of it as some sort of supernatural perception. Like,
the other one I think is good to use too is the way that science would talk about this is science will use the term schema and heuristics. So a schema, if you will, is sort of a mental blueprint of any particular thing. And as you build your mental blueprint, your heuristics are these assumptions that you can now start to make about the world as it fits into your schema. So as an example, from a defender side of the house, right? We want to build a scheme. This is why we watch footage of violence. That's why you watch people engage in crime. Like you do that over and over. And the reason that you do that is you start to build this schema, this mental blueprint of what violent crime looks like. And then as you start to build that out, you start to see these consistent patterns start to emerge. And as you see the consistent pattern, it allows you to now start to make these heuristics, these assumptions about how this thing is going to go down. And then that allows you then to say, if this is going to go down, it's going to start here. And so you place your attention on that point. And so what seems like supernatural attention really isn't. You're ahead of the game. You're waiting for signal to go. And then if you've developed your skill sets to that level of automaticity where it doesn't require you to use RAM to run the skill set, it's just zing, it takes off. That's where, like, for example, really common, you'll see people do this with shot timers, is they'll have a shot timer, they're working a particular skill, whatever it is. But the way they'll set up their shot timer is they'll set it up to consistently go off 2 seconds after they push their activation button, right? So the trouble with that is you have an internal regulator in your head. And so you know that right about this time it's going off. So you're already starting that neurological signal to move. So you've shortcutted all of that perceive signal, select option, begin action, right? That thing we talked about ahead of time. And when you see those people doing these outrageous speeds on Instagram, that's a pretty common thing that you're seeing. But if you go and you set the timer to a random start time, you wouldn't see that same first shot on target time, because now they would actually have to go through that perception lag that we talked about ahead of time. That's why visual stuff takes so much longer, because we can't necessarily predict the visual stuff, and it takes a lot more neurological systems to process visual. So visual stimuli is slower than auditory stimuli. And so if we want to say from an instructor standpoint, we want to help people get sort of a cutting edge. Let's say, for example, they're dealing with just typical bad guy, whatever, pull a gun on us. Well, we would want to stand there and pull guns on them a lot. And we want to show videos of bad guys pulling guns on people. And then as we were doing stuff, we would want them to start to say, wait a minute, what-handed is he? And if you start to identify the guy's right-handed, now your eyes can just go right to that spot where it's like, I'm just looking for you to make this move. And as soon as they go, it's just like a gong in your head. Everything flies out afterwards. And that's sort of where I think you can take and say mindset has these sort of subcomponents where if I'm in this dangerous environment, a lot of my attention is paid to scanning people in visual dead spaces, making assessments on people. I've learned how to make assessments, so I know who I'm looking for and what I'm looking for in them. And then once I found them, now it's like I'm waiting for that thing. What's that one thing I need you to do to kick this off? And as soon as we see it, right, because we've shortened that perception to stimulus loop, we're kicking off a whole lot faster. And I think that's how we can give people this massive cutting edge.
All right. Well, that's a very, I appreciate the thoroughness of that description, because, and you've been using this phrase a number of times, like reducing your RAM or freeing up RAM, random access memory, I think is what it is for the computer thing. It's like, okay, cool. Yep. That makes sense to me. Although I have used it before, so that's a cool one. Can we expand what we're talking about from a scenario around the scenario of being in a defensive encounter to a wider aperture here, which is
sure.
Gun culture writ large. You know, what's the point of winning the gunfight if you're going back to being a miserable person, or something like that? And right, like I kind of want to pull back a little bit, because these instruction tips are, you know, little nuggets of gold within a longer frame, and I want to make sure that we get into gun culture writ large. I was doing something somewhere, and you said citizen versus civilian.
Yep.
And I know there's controversy within the gun culture about civilians versus military and law enforcement. And quite frankly, I think it's dumb. I don't think it's our best foot forward. I think it can very quickly become petty. It's the very pettiness of being, oh, you weren't in the military, you can't learn how to CQB, is the same kind of pettiness of, like, you know, all veterans are dumb. Like, okay, man. But
I think you're saying something very important, right? I think you're saying something very important, right? Especially, you know, this was years ago. If you remember, our employer when we were working together was a Navy SEAL, and I had made the suggestion to him that we should teach some elements of room clearing, and he was in the same boat. It's like, why in the world would we teach them how to do room clearing? And I said, well, if my kid is in this part of the house and I have to get to them, then I'm going to do that. And you can either help me live as I get there, or you can just say, hey, good luck, dude. Or if I find myself in the Kenya Mall attack and I'm going to get out of the building, I'm doing room clearing on the way out. That's what it is. You can help me live, or you can say, hey, good luck to you, dude. I think the big one that we need to be able to do when we're talking about any of those particular deals in a wider set within the gun culture is the tactic is the only thing that's different. The technique isn't different. So why does a citizen need to learn how to do room clearing? Well, because if he's stuck in the Kenya Mall, he's got to get out. Or if his kids are stuck in wherever, he's got to get in. All right, well, all that is the same thing that you're doing. Now, it's going to be different because he's probably going to be by himself versus having a team. So we have to apply it that way. Not to mention his rules of engagement are going to be different, and the odds of his equipment are going to be extremely different. But this is where it's like we're not utilizing some of the amazing talent that we're seeing from so many different people with massive experiences and knowledge, is to take that talent and now stop framing it in the framework that you would see from the military or law enforcement side of the house. You got to reframe it to that citizen and what are his mission objectives and what are his rules of engagement. And if we could do that, right, we would really, I think, vastly improve what the citizens are getting from a defense perspective.
I think the problem struggles with a major duality again, and that duality is, on the one hand, you have this artificial pressure to try to keep certain things special, right?
right. Yes.
Right. And so, like, here's an example. Not giving the nuke codes to every citizen is very different than letting people letting people have the nuke codes is very different than not prohibiting the average citizen from improving their capability of being responsible to their environment, right? So there is this sort of, on the one hand, there's the cultural political push to keep things exclusive, which are usually driven by people who, A, have no knowledge of what they're doing, and B, lack the moral character to understand that. It's the Dunning-Kruger effect compiled with a moral degradation, right? And so I'm doing the right thing, and maybe it's a Midwestern gig, but so you have a challenge here on the one hand where, oh, there you go, I do it again. So there's this challenge on the one side of it being artificial exclusion, which we would call gatekeeping, which is actively being is almost constantly actively being attempted by a government organization.
Sure.
Or is somehow attempting to be codified further into law, which is also being called into question. And then on the other side of the CQB question and the training question and the skill set question is sort of the what for. And
right.
And so I can conclude within a system of rights and a solid belief system of ethics and politics, what the law should entail and what the society should entail, that it shouldn't artificially prohibit people from skill sets that are up to their free will. But it doesn't mean that having that liberty understanding also produces a what for answer. And so you look at, what is one of the things that makes Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Delta Force guys so dangerous is sanction, that they're allowed to go do what they are doing
right.
and they don't come home and face prison time immediately. That's one of the things that makes them most dangerous. And so for the citizen, you have a bit of a challenge that I don't think cannot be overcome. I believe it can be overcome, but requires philosophical dedication and discipline in regards to how you understand the scenario and how you build it up. Because when you encounter, and one of the ways that I think I can understand this is when you encounter somebody who, say, has a lot of nice things, but has fantastical ideas about building a bunker to survive the nuclear EMP Holocaust plus water drought, all things together. The issue that I have with them is not that their idea is bad. I think there's an ethical question of like, you haven't figured out the one purpose of why live. Right. And I think within gun culture as a whole, as it is expanding beyond the gun safe, and it's now you have homesteading and individualism and philosophy and all these other subjects. I think that we have to come to terms with it's a hard question. Just because something isn't gate kept doesn't mean it's a good thing to pursue. And just because it's not a good thing to pursue doesn't mean that the government has a right to regulate it. So these two things exist in duality, and it's the responsibility of the individual and the citizen to humble themselves before the difficulty of the question of saying what for, because it can be answered but requires work.
I know think also too
me rambling. Go ahead.
No, I think that's really good. I think that is a really valuable question. I think this goes back to part of the reason that we discussed so long ago about the difference between a citizen and civilian, right? That you as a citizen have taken up your responsibilities, right? So that's nice that you've got rights, but your rights exist in reference to your responsibilities, right? If you have nothing but rights and no responsibilities, then you're a child. If you have nothing but responsibilities and no rights, you're a slave. So the only way to be a citizen is to have both in equal balance. You have to have them. And I think the element that exists within the gun culture that we should be pressing on for is that if everything is right, even though the phrase, like if everything's a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And we're not going through as a culture to try to help expand things into more of a complete and holistic system. And here's sort of what I mean by that. How many people that carry firearms actually know how to engage in situational awareness? Probably not many. How many people have a post-fight plan, right? They know how to engage in stop the bleed, how to deal with law enforcement as they get on the scene. How many of them actually know their legal rights and responsibilities? Like I was just asking my students the other day, what 3 people can you talk to after your event has occurred that are privileged until after the case is over? There's only 3 people you can talk to. Do you know who they are?
Would it be your lawyer is one of them?
Lawyer's one.
Right. Would your spouse be one?
Spouse is 2.
If as long as the spouse isn't compromised within the context of the situation, I suppose.
Yep. Like even still, on your own private area, those things are still privileged. There's one more.
Okay, so is it going to be the judge? Is it going to be? It's not the police officer. Is it a parent? Is it a family member?
Nope.
No.
It's a licensed psychiatrist or psychologist. That's it. Oh. Those are the 3 people you can talk to. That's it. Everything else is not privileged, which means it can be taken from you.
The fourth branch of power is the psychiatrist. Jordan Peterson
apparently
rules the world.
So, but it's one of those ones where now that begs a larger question, right? To get this concept of holisticness within the gun culture. How many licensed psychologists, psychiatrists are also pro-gun people?
1.5.
Right? How many licensed psychologists, psychiatrists hate your guts that you're carrying a gun and want you to feel guilty about it?
Most. Yeah, I think I can see that. I mean, I don't know. I actually, to be honest, I don't know. I don't know that many people in the field. When I found that out, but I don't know that many.
When I found that out, it suddenly almost became missional. It's like, we need to figure out who are these people that can talk to the people in the gun community that can offer the service. I mean, part of the reason, again, you go back to this concept of stigmatization, the PTSD and all that kind of stuff. Well, there's a reason why a lot of people in the military that may have needed some help, some psychiatric treatment, maybe, right? They wouldn't do it because they got scared out by going, my God, they'll come get my guns later on. And so now we have people with sometimes with underlying latent problems that probably could benefit with talking with someone to help them get through it. And at the same time, they're potentially working with somebody that's willing to set them up for a red flag law later on. So when we think about this element of holisticness within the gun culture, it's like, we're leaving out all kinds of people in this discussion that we probably should be having in there, right? So people from religious and spiritual leaders that are also connected to the gun culture, people that are in the psychology, psychiatrists, people that are in the financial world. How many young guys do you know that drop $30,000 or $40,000 in a gun setup? They're wildly in debt, and it's like, dude, if you listen to Dave Ramsey or something, I mean, come on. But it's like, we're so scattered out where, this was such a normal thing for people to be involved in gun culture. I mean, you used to be able to order guns out of Sears catalogs delivered to your house. And now it's this hyper specialized deal where everybody feels like they're in some kind of a tribe. Like you mentioned before, you team Lucas or you team whatever. And it's like, that's the part that's not doing a good thing for us. I think one of the best things we could do is the next time we have one of these big, NRA conventions or, USCCA convention, is they get as many of these gun ninjas to sit on the stage at once and actually make them answer some of these harder questions, right? Don't blow me off with something. There's no time for ninja theatrics, but let's sit here and just have this conversation. And, that kind of a panel getting asked these questions would be super valuable, I think, for the community.
Well, if this show can grow in size, I think we can start doing that. Unfortunately can't, you know what I mean? But I appreciate it. I'll take that. I will claim the credit for your idea as if it was my own. So, but I mean, this is yeah, I know this is recorded and being placed on the online, so that it'll be recorded. But it is known. But no, I do I'm right there with you. I appreciate it, and that's part of the things I want to be able to. I want us to continue to knuckle down on the hard questions, because when you started talking about it earlier, you said, okay, so how many people know what they're going to do after after the threat is solved, right? After the metaphorical, mythical Americana gas station 2 a.m. bedroom gunshot happens, what are you going to do? The first thing I was thinking was oh no, this is just adding more tools to the toolbox without explaining the tools. But when you got to the psychiatrist, it's like, okay, that helped out a lot. Okay, so now, one of the best examples that I keep seeing is I'm sorry, maybe not the best examples, but one of the things that Nathan Spearing was talking about on episode 3 was well, have productive property before you buy a gun, and I'm like, I don't want to hear that, dude. No, I want to hear, and I don't, and I know you can turn this into a really, really meta version of a 1990s joke. I don't want to be responsible. I want to get drunk. No, it's, I don't own guns to protect the arbitrary concept of my existence.
Right.
If I'm defending something. If I'm defending something, some of that is my family. And some of the extension of that family is my home, and some of the extension of my family is my property, to the extent that, if my property is such that it disappears at anyone's random whim, it gets hard to live. And that is even worse. It's not even the utility of it, it's the breakdown of culture, of society. Like, I do not want to live in a world where people don't have private property. Excuse me, Karl Marx, not interested. That is the most damning element of socialism, is the abolition of private property. It's that you have no life. You're not alive anymore. You're just a number to be counted at that point in time.
No, you're a drone.
So
you're a drone. Live in the pod, eat the bugs. Mm-hmm. Yep. No, I think that's exactly right. One of the questions we used to ask at DMT all the time before we got started with classes is we would say, for the sake of what are you here? Why are you doing this? Why are you giving yourself this time? And the reason why we would say it is the better you have an answer for that, the better your training is going to be, because suddenly you put you put some meat on why you're giving yourself this effort. Why are you letting somebody look at your technique over and over and over and say, fix this, fix it again, fix it again. I mean, it eventually becomes very challenging, right? I think from a philosophical perspective, like, that's the reason why Marcus Aurelius always said, remember, you will die, right? The purpose is, what the heck am I doing right now? Why am I going to do that? If I'm going to die, what is the purpose of this? And I think the same thing is true when we think about what is the purpose of doing training? Why do I spend the money on the training stuff rather than buying yet another set of dual tube phosphorus nods, right? Like, that it's, that's another part that's in the gun culture that's so big, is that we spend so much money on gear and so little on training that I just go, man. But that's the question that you should start to ask is, okay, why? What am I doing this for? And the more you can dig into that, I think you're going to get much better results.
Yeah, and I've been on the criticism side of, like, the gear train, and I think everybody has. Like, it's not very hard to, it's not very hard. Like, dude, there's so many ways you can play that card out. Oh, why do you? Well, you've got a lot of nice gear, but you're not in shape. You're a loot drop. It's all funny, right? Like, it is. I remember, I even remember when, like, in 2020 in the riots in Minneapolis, it's like when the quote unquote Boogaloo Boys came out, and there were like 4 of them, and you're like, oh, this isn't serious. There's nothing serious here. Right. They're a threat because they're not a serious threat in the sense of them being like a dangerous, articulate threat. They're a danger because they're so easily swayed by they're so easily swayed to the fact that they made the joke real. Like, it was an inside joke that was funny, and you decided that it wasn't an inside joke. It was you tried to make it your reality, and it's like,
it was a real thing.
Oh. Yeah, dude, it's not funny anymore. You killed the joke, dude, man. But I think within gun culture writ large, there's no shortage of criticism saying, well, don't buy gear, get training. There's no shortage of criticism towards the gear collection and the having stuff versus doing stuff. I don't think there's any shortage of it. I think it's a really hard question. Mm-hmm. And it's a hard question that has to be engaged with, because there's sort of a hierarchy. Mission dictates gear, mission dictates tactics, tactics guide gear selection. And if you don't have a mission, you don't really, because being a civilian, you don't have Operation Dark Horse and Operation Sisyphus, and we're going to go hunt Bin Laden. You're like, my operation for the day is to cook dinner, love my wife, make money to keep the bills on the table, pay attention to my environment so I know who I'm going to vote for. It's make sure my garden doesn't make my neighbors hate me. These kind of things, right? Like, the mission is very long tail for the citizens. It's very long tail. It's not, okay, cool, now I get back from the night raid or whatever, and I put my feet on the desk and I drink a beer and I'm like, yes, good job, man, yay. It's much more long tail, and as a result, it's much more difficult to formulate. And as a result of it being much more difficult to formulate, it's really easy to substitute in the short term with gear purchases and gear acquisition. And then your gear starts driving your decisions. And then your desire to buy a new set of dual tubes starts determining your life event. And that's where you're like, no, dude, it's not a vibe. It's like what you've made it your personality. And then I'm not okay with that. I think you need to be a person again. So I admit it. Admittedly, I understand how the pull into gear happens within gun cultures because it's at least tangible.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem with it is it doesn't have a long tail. What for?
No, it's very short.
And that is a question that can be answered.
I think the other one too, from a larger perspective, we're getting to something really critical, right? Is that I think one of the largest crises facing us as citizens and as men in general, right, is this crisis of meaning. There was an interview that went down between Matthias Desmet and Tucker Carlson a few weeks to a few months ago, and he describes that something like 65 or 70% of Americans describe their jobs as bullshit jobs. And it's like, that's a really challenging spot to be, right? So if you're engaging in this crisis of meaning, you know what I mean? That going out and buying another set of dual tubes is no different in some regards than going out and getting my fourth beer, right? That it's just a way to fill in the gap of meaning that exists inside of me. And so now you start to ask the questions like, are you connected to a community? Are you connected to a group of people? Are you connected to something that's bigger and larger than yourself? Have you been able to connect these actions and what you're doing to a purpose that drives it rather than the stuff driving a purpose, right? So, if you're saying to yourself, I'm going to defend the house. All right, cool. So I'm going to get a gun. Cool. I'm still defending the house. All right. So how do I going to do that? Well, I'm going to learn how to run the gun. All right, cool. Well, as you learn more and more about riding the gun, you may eventually say to yourself, I don't know how to do this in the dark, right? That should start with saying, how do I do this in the dark? And then we start leading into gear, because that mission still is overarching. I'm going to defend the house. I'm going to defend the house. This is where I really like the concept of...
and not being a... They did it again. Sorry, the post office here isn't exactly reliable. And not going into the if you're listening to this and your package, you ordered something from the shop and it got a day late, I apologize. I got to take it to the post office today. But making excuses. I'm making excuses. So it's part of gun culture is having the house. It's trying to fulfill the house, and there's always a danger of looking at the world at it as it is and saying 65% of men don't have a purpose, or say their job is a bullshit job. You can either approach that with nihilism,
right?
Become nihilistic. Right. Oh, there is no purpose, or you can recognize that and try to find a way to solve it. Because it's at least you want to know if life is so meaningless, here's an attempt. At least the attempt of trying to find meaning is better than the acceptance of no meaning.
Yes, I think
even
Peterson gets into that a lot, where he talks about the purpose of nihilism. Yeah, the purpose of nihilism is to reject responsibility. And this is where we get into this concept of being able to say that by embracing these responsibilities, I help to find meaning. And so, the purpose of defending the house isn't, okay, I'm just defending the house. The purpose of defending the house is I'm responsible for the house and those that are inside. And that's where you start to have that element of meaning. Well, if I'm responsible for it. That, by the way, was part of the reason how I convinced my wife, who came from a no-gun family at all, like they're anti-gun extremely, to being very pro-firearm, was when she realized that I had taken it as my responsibility to defend the house. She literally said to herself, who the heck am I to say how you're supposed to do that? And that changed her framework on it entirely. So, I think that embracing of that responsibility of being a citizen, that's why it's so valuable, right? Because if you embrace the responsibility of being a father, well, then you embrace the responsibility of your sons, of being able to provide, of being able to make sure the house is safe and secure, that the children that you raise are people that people would like to be with, and that they can continue to progress in with their own families sometime in the future. If you decide to take on this role as a husband, or right, as a partner, right, same deal, right? You've decided that my journey through life is also directly connected to you, and therefore I bear responsibility to you. And I bear the responsibility to help you carry through things and help you continue to find purpose and meaning and growth. If I decide to take the responsibility of keeping and bearing arms, well, then I decide to also take on the responsibility of judiciously using that thing when it's appropriate. to knowing the laws, to being able to make sure that everything isn't just simply a nail because all I got is a hammer because that's all I know how to do with it, right? That I've connected it into things that are greater than just the fact that the thing goes pew and I spend time poking holes in paper. So, no, I think the quest for meaning is also the quest for responsibility.
Yeah, that's probably the most. I responded in a way that wasn't appropriate. But
deep philosophical things happening in your brain.
Well, yeah, it's something that I've heard before, but I've heard it, but I have heard it before, but it's not one that you go fall asleep, right? It's not like, oh, okay. It's one of those things where, like, it is the question that I think many of us are trying to figure out. It is a part that's a good, but I'm stumbling over myself right now. I keep returning to the question of what for is a very hard question, but it can be answered, and it can be answered poorly with consequences, and it can be answered diligently with good outcomes. And so one of the things that I've said this before, I'm an optimist when it comes to the gun culture. I think it's very realistic that we could see a severe curtailing or repealing of the NFA in our lifetime. I think that we could see on the cultural level, it's not that we're like, oh, we're accepted. You know, gun culture is never intended to be something so putridly superficial as like, oh, just accept me the way I am. It's like, you know, when somebody tells me that me deciding to carry a firearm because I want to or own a firearm is just paranoia, like, I'm not really concerned about your opinion about anything anymore. It doesn't bother me. I don't. We said it before. I don't debate plumbing with people who don't believe in pipes. Right.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's a hard question that has to be answered. There's due diligence that must be done by the individual. No one can do that for you artificially. No one can produce in you a sense of meaning. But you have to pursue it. And sometimes the pursuit of it alone is that which leads you to the next step of generating the possibility, generating the next piece. And so with humility, we avoid feedback loops of, buy gun, get reward, buy gun, get reward, buy gun, get reward. But we also, with courage, have to face that negativity. There's a word I'm looking for, but it's been a good dive into this, a good conversation.
Yeah, I think that it's one that I agree that the gun industry has to work on. You see, you make an important point. We can reference back to something from the beginning, right? You went off and you did all this stuff that was, being a ranger, and you eventually stepped forward to get this thing that declared you as a ranger. But the reality is you were a ranger long before some thing on your arm declared you as a ranger, right? I used to be, I have personal training certs. I owned a gym, and, we had a client who was trying to lose a bunch of weight, and he would come in, we'd see how you were doing X, Y, and Z. And, I had 2 pizzas the other day and 2 liters of Coke. And after the third time that happened, we fired him. We fired him as a client. We're like, you don't really want to do this. You're wasting your money. You're wasting your time. You don't really want this, right? You go, buy diet pills or something, like really, like, you don't really want this. You want some quick fix. You don't want the reality. And you want to feel like you do ever, you
don't want to actually do it.
Yeah. If you ever feel like you decide you really want to actually get this done, you call us again. And so it was about a year later, he reached out to one of us, and we were in a situation where it didn't work to bring him back in because it was a really boutique place. And so we said, yeah, as soon as there's an opening, we'll let you back in. Well, he decided, you know what, I'm just going to go into the gym. And so he did. And he started attending group aerobics classes and whatever else. The next time we saw him a year and a half later, he'd lost 150 pounds. And he made the decision. He did it, right? And that I think is the element, right? Is that the hardest work is really to make the deciding, right? It goes back to the concepts within Sun Tzu, right? Once you cross the area, you burn the boats, because there aren't any other choices. That's what deciding means. In the Greek, it means to cut off from all other choices. And that element of decision of working and discussing the why and finding purpose, it's always going to be challenging. We're always going to be struggling with that. And you're going to have different seasons in your life where you're going to wonder, what's the reason why am I doing this versus doing that? And that, I think, too, is one of the ones where, there's almost an expectation that we'll kind of find this, and suddenly we're going to coast into whatever the future is going to look like, right? So I shoot faster than what I did when I was, say, 30, right? Just because my neurology is better, right? But my ability to manage the recoil is diminished because I'm not as strong as I was when I was 30. And so now I have to dive deeper into the technical side of holding the firearm versus, hey, I can just muscle this thing in place. And that's made me a better firearms instructor, because now I had to dig in so deep into the physics of how the gun moves and the physiology of the body so that I can communicate that now a whole lot better to, say, a 100-pound woman than I could have when I was 30, when it was like, well, we can just do this and we hang on to it. And so these changes are going to continue to happen to us over the course of your life. Your ability for vision, your ability for stability, right? Your ability to respond is going to decrease. All of these things are going to change. And we're going to look at ourselves and say, man, I remember being able to do this. Why can't I do it like that? And in some regards, it's very frustrating, right? Being a guy that was a collegiate runner, I remember what it was like in my head to run sub 5-minute miles and do it for miles. And now it's like the concept of making a 10-minute mile, and I go, right? Because I just crossed I'm almost 45. So it's a lot harder than it was, 25 years ago. And so that quest for meaning changes all the way through your life. It's a really, it's an amazing thing. And I think that we need to keep encouraging all the people that train with us and work with us to keep looking for what is that quest change? What's that thing that we're working towards, right? Don't get stagnated into it. Find that next thing that you're trying to develop. What's this next missional thing that occurs in your life? And that's where people training is going to weave in and weave out, right? You're going to see people come in, they'll go for a while, they'll come back for a while. And so, how can we do the best we can to try to build those people and let them journey on through? If there's one thing I could say that I'm most proud of with what DMT does, it's not that we produce people that can defend themselves. That's great. We do that. That's awesome. I'm happy about that. The biggest piece is that you start to see people take on this sort of missional role of protector. You see them take on this missional role of being responsible for this. And then as they see people not taking on the responsibility, it starts to, they go like, wait a minute. And they now suddenly have conversations with friends like, hey, come in here. Let's do some more training. Let's be more responsible, and you're suddenly seeing, I have a client, her name is Mimi, and she's 75 years old. She started training with us 2 years ago, right? She's a single woman. She lives by herself. And the first time we would go to the range, right? I mean, barely getting a single shot off. She's terrified by the firearm. The woman now appendix carries a Glock 19 MOS with a freaking Holosun optic on it and runs it as well as some of my guys that have been training with me for years before. But here it was, she said, I can't be the person that's terrified by myself alone. I'm going to go do this. But the part that did for her wasn't just that. She now started jumping into travel things that she would have never done before. So the confidence she builds being able to do the one translates into that missional search for more meaning and experience in those other realms. And I think that's the great mission in life, right there it is.
Well, that's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing to hear that. It's a good thing to hear that you have seen it, and it's in a sense, receive the fruits of your labors, even though if it's different, then, it's not like, oh, I made a Navy SEAL today. It's like, oh, so it is there. We as a gun culture can get kind of cringy to try to look for success stories where they're not there. But then we also can just as easily become so cynical and not see the good that for what it is. So, well, with that, I'm going to let's end this conversation and let's have another one. Let's schedule another one for the future sometime, because this was a good talk. I really appreciate it. It's good to see you again.
Thank you. You too.
So for those who are, for those who are still listening, where can they find you? where can they follow you? Where can they do the thing? Do the thing.
Main website is defensivemindsettraining.com. They can check out the Defender University there. We're also found on Facebook at Defensive Mindset Training and on Instagram as at DMT Defenders.
Okay. And then for people who are in Minnesota, do you hold at site training as well?
Yeah, we're training 5-7 days a week at our location in New Hope.
Okay, cool. So if people want to instruct, okay, cool. And then for those of you who are following us, you know where to find us. This is the Redacted Culture Cast, where we host the more meaningful conversations to be found within gun culture as it expands well beyond the gun safe. I guess I can use that as a quote now. Thank you very much for your support. I know, right? Thank you very much for your support. Thank you very much for what you've done for us as far as, sharing our stuff, sharing our content, following our stories on Instagram, participating in social media. We hope that the time that you give us is respected. So we thank you for paying attention to our conversations. If you want to continue to support the channel at this time, the best and really only way to do it, if you want to do it with money, is buy our merchandise. We'll get it to you as fast as we can. With that being said, our shows are if this is your first time here, you know that our show are not. If this is your first time here, our conversations are published every Monday and Wednesday. So other than that, we look forward to seeing you soon. And Beau, thanks for coming on the show. We look forward to having another conversation. And now let's connive in the after show.